Welcome back to the channel. There are moments in the night when the boundaries between waking and dreaming blur, forming a space that feels strangely suspended between two realities. In that space, the body lies still, heavy, unmoving, while the mind awakens just enough to recognize the room around it. This state is known as sleep paralysis, and even though science has studied it for decades, the experience remains deeply personal, intimate, and often unsettling. Sleep paralysis occurs when the brain wakes up before the body does. During certain stages of sleep, especially REM sleep, the body naturally becomes temporarily paralyzed so that dreams cannot be physically acted out. Usually, the brain and body return to full awareness together. But in sleep paralysis, something becomes misaligned. The brain regains consciousness while the body remains locked in that state of stillness. The result is a person who is awake, aware, yet unable to move, speak, or call out. This alone can be frightening, but for many, the experience goes further. It is extremely common for people to sense a presence in the room at the same time. Some describe it as a shadow standing near the bed, others as something sitting quietly, watching from the corner. Sometimes, the presence feels neutral, simply there. Other times, it feels heavy, intentional, as if the moment itself has meaning. The brain, caught between dream and reality, may generate images or impressions that feel real: a silhouette, a whisper, a quiet weight on the chest. Neuroscientists suggest that these figures are the mind's way of interpreting fear while trapped in a vulnerable state. When the brain recognizes that the body cannot move, the amygdala, the part responsible for detecting danger, activates instinctively. Unable to identify a real threat, it may project one, using imagery gathered from memory, culture, or imagination. In this view, the shadow figure is not something external, but something created within. Yet, many people across the world describe the presence with remarkable consistency, even when separated by geography, language, and belief. Ancient folklore, religious texts, and modern stories echo the same central image: a silent figure watching in the dark. Whether this points to a shared psychological pattern or something more universal remains open to interpretation. So perhaps sleep paralysis is simply the brain waking up unevenly. Or perhaps, in those thin seconds before we fully return to waking life, we glimpse something that normally stays just out of sight. One of the most recognizable parts of this experience is the feeling of weight pressing down on the chest. It can feel like something is sitting on you, holding you still, or quietly leaning forward as if to observe. During sleep paralysis, the body's breathing naturally becomes shallow. This is normal in REM sleep, when the body is conserving energy and the muscles are mostly inactive. But when you become conscious in the middle of this, the slow and restricted breathing feels foreign, almost like it is happening from outside your control. The instinctive reaction is panic. The mind, searching for a reason, often creates one. In medical terms, the chest pressure happens because the intercostal muscles, the muscles between the ribs, are still in their sleep-induced state of paralysis. The diaphragm is still working, but only enough to maintain minimal breathing. The mismatch between awareness and bodily function becomes an eerie sensation of being held down. But the human experience of this moment goes beyond what scientific vocabulary can neatly contain. Many people do not describe it as muscle atonia or restricted respiratory rhythm. They describe it as someone being there. It is the sense of intention that makes it unforgettable. Even when no figure is seen, the presence feels directed, like attention focused on you. The air feels thick. The silence takes on weight. Some say it feels like being watched. Others say it feels like being studied. A few describe it as if the presence is waiting for something, though what exactly remains nameless. And perhaps that is what makes sleep paralysis so deeply unsettling. Not the lack of control itself, but the feeling that we are not alone in that moment of helplessness. Science explains the mechanics, but the meaning, the why of that presence remains uncertain. Among the most widely reported details during sleep paralysis is the appearance of a shadow-like figure. Sometimes it stands in the corner of the room, still and formless. Other times, it appears closer next to the bed, at the foot of it, or leaning just within reach. People describe it not as a fully defined person, but as a silhouette, tall, dark, without features, yet unmistakably aware. Neuroscience suggests that this figure comes from a blend of dream imagery and the brain's heightened fear response. When the mind wakes, while the body remains paralyzed, the amygdala, the center responsible for detecting danger, triggers instinctively. It senses vulnerability and prepares the body for a threat it cannot yet identify. In that confusion, the brain may create a shape to represent that fear, familiar enough to be recognized as someone, but vague enough to remain mysterious. However, what makes this phenomenon compelling is how consistent the descriptions are across cultures, continents, and centuries. People who have never heard of sleep paralysis describe nearly identical figures. In some stories, the shadow watches. In others, it approaches. Rarely does it speak. It simply exists, silent, patient, and present. There is something almost symbolic about it. A shape without detail. A presence without a face. It is fear given form, yet it feels like more than fear. Folklore interprets this figure differently. Some say it is a wandering spirit. Others describe it as a guardian, a visitor, or an echo of something that exists in a space we rarely notice. In certain traditions, the shadow is not a threat, but a witness appearing in moments when the boundary between waking life and the unseen world becomes thin. Whether created by the mind or encountered from beyond, the experience leaves a lasting impression. The shadow figure does not chase, shout, or demand. It simply is, and the memory of its presence lingers long after the body finally moves again. To understand why the mind creates such vivid experiences, we can look at the moments that frame sleep. The transition into sleep is called the hypnagogic state, and the transition out of sleep is the hypnopompic state. These periods are when the brain is most suggestible, neither fully dreaming nor fully awake. Images, sounds, and sensations can drift freely here, often without logic or sequence. When sleep paralysis occurs, the brain wakes up during one of these transitions, while fragments of dream imagery are still active. Visual processing regions may still be generating shapes and outlines from internal memory. Auditory centers may produce hushed whispers, or the sense that something is moving in the room. The mind is awake enough to perceive the environment, but not yet stable enough to separate imagination from reality. From a scientific perspective, the shadow figure or presence can be seen as a hallucination formed from overlapping states of consciousness. The brain is trying to interpret incomplete information, a darkened room, a frozen body, an activated fear response. Without clear input, it fills the space with the most evolutionarily familiar shape of danger, a human form. Yet, this explanation does not diminish the emotional impact. The experience feels real because, in that moment, the mind is fully convinced it is real. The heartbeat quickens, the breath tightens, the room seems heavier than before. And there is something else. People often describe the figure as aware, not random. Even though science interprets it as a projection of the mind, many describe the presence as having its own focus, its own quiet intention. This is where the boundaries blur. Is the mind simply misfiring as it re-enters consciousness? Or is sleep a doorway one we cross every night without realizing how thin it really is? The answer depends on where one chooses to stand, fully in the light of science, or somewhere in the soft shadow between dream and waking. Deep in the brain sits a small almond-shaped structure called the amygdala. It is one of the oldest parts of the human nervous system, older, in evolutionary terms, than reason, memory, or language. Its purpose is simple and primal: detect danger. It reacts before thought, before logic, before explanation. When something feels wrong, the amygdala is the first to know. During sleep paralysis, the amygdala is awake, but the body cannot respond. This creates a conflict. The brain is not built to resolve easily. The instinct says, there is danger. Move, fight, protect yourself. But the body does not move. And when the body does not obey, the mind searches for a cause, a shape, a presence, a reason to match the fear. Fear rarely arrives as an abstract feeling. It looks for a form. So the brain gives it one. A shadow is the simplest possible shape. No details, no identity, just a suggestion of someone or something there. In a sense, the shadow figure is the brain's minimal definition of danger, a placeholder for the unknown. But here is where the explanation becomes less comfortable. If the shadow were merely fear made visible, we would expect each person's version to be different. But instead, across cultures, across languages, across thousands of years of recorded accounts, the figure is nearly always the same: tall, dark, watching, silent. This consistency raises a quiet question. Is the amygdala reacting to something imagined or to something remembered? There are stories, old stories, that suggest humans once recognized the shadow as something familiar, a visitor that came to the threshold between waking and dreaming, a traveler of the in-between. Not necessarily malicious, simply present. Science calls it a hallucination. Folklore calls it a presence. Experience lies somewhere in the middle. In the stillness of sleep paralysis, the amygdala speaks the oldest language we know. Be aware. You are not alone. Across the world, long before medical science offered any explanation, people described the same experience through the lens of their own culture. In Newfoundland, the phenomenon is known as the old hag, a figure said to sit on the chest and steal one's breath. In medieval Europe, it was associated with incubi and succubi, spirits believed to visit at night and blur the line between dreams and the physical world. In Japan, the experience is called kanashibari, implying being bound or tied by invisible force. In Vietnam and much of Southeast Asia, the term ma de or bong de suggests a ghost or spirit pressing down, an unseen presence asserting weight and attention. Despite distance, culture, and language, these stories share the same core image: a being that appears when the body cannot move, but the mind is awake. Folklore did not treat this as an accident or a glitch in the body. Instead, it was understood as a moment of contact, a crossing of paths, a brush between the visible and the invisible. Communities created rituals to protect themselves, charms to hang near the bed, prayers whispered before sleep. These practices were not merely to prevent fear. They were acknowledgments that the experience mattered, that it existed in a space where the human world and another world briefly touched. The most intriguing part is how consistent the emotional tone is across cultures. Not simply fear, but the sense of being seen. Not just paralyzed, but observed. The presence is never described as random. It has focus, awareness, proximity. Whether interpreted as spirits, ancestor echoes, night demons, or dreamwalkers, the stories align in shape and sensation. This shared narrative suggests something deeper than coincidence. Either the human mind is wired to produce the same symbolic figure under stress, or cultures around the world have been naming the same silent visitor in different ways for centuries. Science explains the mechanism. Culture explains the meaning. And sleep paralysis remains where those two interpretations overlap, a universal experience with 1,000 names. Although the experience feels mysterious, there is a pattern in when it appears. Sleep paralysis is far more common when someone is exhausted, anxious, or emotionally overwhelmed. When the mind is stressed, sleep becomes lighter and more fragmented. The body tries to rest, but the thoughts continue moving. This creates openings, small cracks, where waking and dreaming can overlap. Irregular sleep schedules, staying up too late, sleeping in unfamiliar places, or experiencing prolonged periods of worry all increase the chances of these episodes. The more unsettled the inner world becomes, the thinner the boundary between consciousness and the subconscious grows. Yet stress alone does not fully explain why the experience feels so vivid, so charged with presence. If it were simply exhaustion, one might expect the sensations to feel chaotic or random. But instead, the encounters often feel structured. A quiet figure, a heavy atmosphere, a moment of being watched. It is as if the mind is not simply breaking down under stress, but revealing something usually hidden. There is a theory in psychology suggesting that when the brain is overwhelmed, suppressed emotions and unprocessed fears take shape in dreams. During sleep paralysis, the mind is awake enough to witness these forms directly. In this view, the shadow is not an external being at all, but the part of ourselves we avoid seeing in the light of day. Fear with a body, uncertainty with a face we cannot quite make out. Yet there is another interpretation, older and harder to dismiss. Many traditional cultures believe that when someone is emotionally vulnerable, the spirit world pays closer attention, not to harm, but to respond. A thinness in the self opens a doorway not just for fear, but for contact. Whether one prefers the language of neurons or the language of spirits, the pattern is the same. When the heart is unsettled and the mind is tired, the space between worlds becomes easier to step into. And sometimes, something steps through. From a medical standpoint, sleep paralysis is considered harmless. The body eventually releases itself from the state of muscle atonia. Breathing returns to normal rhythm, and movement slowly returns as the brain fully awakens. No lasting physical damage is done. Doctors often describe the experience as nothing more than a misalignment in the sleep cycle, a temporary delay between mind and body syncing back together. In clinical terms, the event is ordinary, explainable, and without risk. But that explanation does not match how it feels. The emotional imprint of the experience tends to linger far longer than the episode itself. Many people remember every detail, the stillness, the unbroken silence, the way the room seemed to hold its breath, and above all, the presence. Even if one understands the science completely, the memory does not fade like a dream. It sits quietly in the mind, resurfacing at night when the room grows dark again. Some people begin sleeping with lights on. Others avoid sleeping on their backs. Some develop a reluctance to fall asleep at all, fearing that they might return to that thin and suspended state. The interesting part is that not all memories of sleep paralysis are purely fearful. A few describe the experience as strangely calm. The presence can feel watchful rather than threatening, aware rather than hostile. For some, the moment becomes contemplative, a glimpse into a space rarely seen, something between waking and dreaming, body and mind, seen and unseen. This emotional complexity is what keeps the phenomenon from being neatly boxed into one category. Science can describe the mechanism. Psychology can describe the fear. Folklore can describe the visitor. But none of these fully account for the quiet weight of the memory itself. Sleep paralysis asks nothing, demands nothing. It simply happens. Yet when it does, it feels like a moment that is not supposed to be witnessed. It's a moment we were not meant to be awake for. And once we experience it, we cannot unknow it. The night never feels quite the same again. Sleep paralysis exists in a space that refuses to settle completely on one side or the other. Science can map the electrical signals of the brain, measure muscle tone, identify REM cycles, and explain how consciousness can awaken unevenly. Yet even with all of that knowledge, something remains unanswered. The meaning of the experience does not fit easily into charts or terminology. The feeling of presence, the shared shape of the shadow, the sense of being observed, these elements persist across cultures and lifetimes, as though they belong to something older than memory. For some, that presence is simply the mind protecting itself, forming a shape for fear. For others, it is a reminder that the world is not limited to what we see in daylight. There are layers of perception, thresholds of awareness, and states of being that we rarely acknowledge, except in moments when consciousness slips. A night has always been a place where the unseen is given room to breathe. Sleep paralysis is one of the few times a person becomes awake inside that space. The truth is, no one can say with certainty whether the shadow is entirely internal or partially external. The brain is powerful enough to create realities that feel indistinguishable from the physical world. Yet history is full of accounts suggesting that the unseen sometimes brushes against the seen. Perhaps the presence is a psychological artifact. Or perhaps the mind, unguarded in that transition, becomes able to perceive something that is always there but usually beyond our awareness. The boundary is thin, too thin to dismiss either possibility. So the question remains suspended, like the experience itself. When we lie still in the dark, unable to move yet fully aware, are we simply trapped between sleep cycles? Or are we witnessing the quiet architecture of another layer of existence? There is no definitive answer. Only the memory of the room, the stillness, the breath, and the presence that did not need to speak to be understood. When the body finally releases and movement returns, the world settles back into its familiar shape. The room is just a room again. The air is ordinary. The silence no longer holds weight. You breathe, blink, shift your limbs, and everything seems the way it should. Yet the memory stays close, like something that happened in another country, but still somehow belongs to you. You might sit up and look around, making sure nothing is there. You might tell yourself it was only the brain, only a misfired connection, only a dream lodged halfway into waking. And maybe it was. But the feeling is harder to explain away. The sense that something was with you does not vanish simply because daylight arrives. This is the part of sleep paralysis that lingers. Not the paralysis itself, but the knowing. The quiet awareness that, for a moment, the world felt layered. That reality had texture. That the night was not empty. People rarely talk about the episodes that feel calm or strangely intimate, where the presence does not threaten but simply observes. These moments are confusing in their own way, because they suggest that the experience is not purely born from fear. Something about it feels intentional, even if the purpose stays unspoken. And so you are left with a question that does not demand an answer, but refuses to disappear. Was it only the mind, building shadows out of fear and breathlessness? Or is the mind, in that moment between worlds, simply seeing something it normally does not. Sleep paralysis does not provide conclusions. It offers encounters, brief, silent, uncertain. And when morning comes, the mind returns to logic, to routine, to sunlight, and conversation, and ordinary life. But somewhere in the background, just behind thought, the memory continues. The night is not always empty, and sleep is not always a closed door. So, what we call sleep paralysis may be a bridge, one built between the familiar world we move through in daylight and the quieter, hidden one we pass through each night. Science explains the mechanics, the mind waking too soon, the body still resting, the brain searching for meaning in the dark. Culture gives it shape, a name, a story to place beside the fear. And experience gives it weight, because whatever happens in those moments feels undeniably real. Whether the presence we sense is just the echo of our own mind, or something that stands just beyond our ordinary field of perception, remains unanswered. And perhaps it is not a question we are meant to solve. Perhaps it is simply something we are meant to notice. If tonight feels quiet, and the dark feels still, remember that you have crossed that boundary before, and you've found your way back. Thank you for watching. Take care of your rest, and we will meet again in the next story.